All right, I think we're all set. People can just roll in and catch up. Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to another Amplifying BIPOC Voices in Sustainability. ABVS is hosted by the Social Sustainability Coalition, which is an intern team within the UW-Madison Office of Sustainability. Thank you again for joining us tonight for our conversation around storytelling and sustainability. And just a quick note, we do have the option for closed captioning, so it should be found on the bottom of your screen if you'd like to use that. Just before we jump in, we at the Office of Sustainability want to acknowledge the lack of racial diversity, both within our team and more widely in our office. This reflects a larger trend across campus and in mainstream environmentalism, in which the necessary and valuable voices of Black and Indigenous people of color, who have long led the fight to protect our communities and the environment, are excluded. We've created this series in an effort to recenter these voices within our own campus community. We would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous Ho-Chunk land our university occupies by reading our land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. If you are joining from a place outside of Madison, we urge you to educate yourself on the land you reside on and its history of forceful removal of Indigenous peoples. And then finally, we believe it is important to acknowledge that sustainability is not just about the environment, but is also intertwined with social and economic factors and influences. This series will help to illuminate those facets of sustainability. So for today's panel, we have two incredible guest speakers and storytellers, Professor Theresa Delgadillo and UW's Tribal Relations Director, Erin Bird-Bear. Each speaker will introduce themselves for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will open up the panel for discussion. To begin, we can have Professor Delgadillo introduce herself.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I grew up in this state and in this area, though I'm pretty new to Madison. I teach Latina and Latino literature, and I have a feeling that you asked me to be on this panel because I've been working on a project for the last few years that thinks about placemaking and sustainability and the relationship between cultural and social expression and the physical places that we live, and considering how we live in those places. So I'm looking forward to talking with all of you about that project a little bit more in this conversation. Thanks so much.
Awesome, thank you so much. We look forward to it. And then we can move on to Erin.
Hanichara Haipi, Erin Bird-Bear Gahinigaide. And that was just my very rough Ho-Chunk language. Since we're in the ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk, I just said, it's nice to be here. My name is Erin Bird-Bear in the Ho-Chunk language. I'm not Ho-Chunk, I'm a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Ripper Nation, which is what is now North and South Dakota. I'm also a Navajo Nation descendant. We call ourselves the Dene. The Spanish called us the Navajo. So I'm Mandan, Hidatsa, and Dene. And I'm the inaugural Tribal Relations Director here at UW-Madison. And I've been working at the campus since the year 2000. So this is my 22nd year working at UW-Madison. And I was going to share a quick PowerPoint to kind of give an introduction, an overview, a little bit about Indigenous nations and the various creation stories they have that are related to the environment. I was asked to participate today because I developed the First Nations Cultural Landscape Tour here at UW-Madison back in 2003. as a kind of transition tool for Native American students, but we found that it had benefits for everybody on campus to learn about the indigeneity of the space and how special Dejope is as a cultural center for thousands of years. And so that kind of storytelling about trying to weave a narrative where the student voice was in the center of the story. So we really leveraged the Memorial Union, the class of 1888 marker, to show the shifting understanding of Indigenous peoples and the relationship that our institution has had with Native nations over time. And so just a really important kind of acknowledgement. And about the land acknowledgement, I'm putting in the chat now. Never good to put a link in while you're talking, but I put in a link in the chat now, a link to land acknowledgement guidance, because the Our Shared Future Heritage Marker, which was developed in 2019 here at UW-Madison, was never intended to be a land acknowledgement statement. And so, but in the UW-Madison does not have an institutional land acknowledgement statement as a university, and nature abhors a vacuum. And so because of that, everybody's just glommed onto the Our Shared Future Heritage Marker as a land acknowledgement statement. So I put in the chat a guidance that I put on the Tribal Relations website about guidance in developing land acknowledgement statements. And importantly, they should come with actions and commitments. So it's really important to say that we're going to do X, Y, or Z because our organization has values A, B, and C. And so commitments are really important parts of those statements. And so there's a little bit of guidance on writing land acknowledgements that I put in the chat. But I'll switch over to a PowerPoint real quick, and then I'll turn that off and we'll get going for question and answer. So I'm going to hit the share screen button correctly. And now I will enlarge it. There we go. I got to move this out of the way. All right, so just our cover sheet here. And just a quick reminder, I'll be talking in somewhat a little bit of generalization, but it's really important to get specific to a specific culture or language. And so in this case, there are 12 American Indian nations here in Wisconsin, 11 of which are part of the 574 federally recognized Native nations and the additional 63 state recognized nations who collectively speak 169 different indigenous languages on our continent today. So continents are always very diverse, and we're very special as a state in that we have so many Native nations within us east of the Mississippi River, and we have 7 different languages spoken between these communities. So, and they're wildly culturally different from each other because they come from different language families. So like Slavic peoples are not the same as Romance language speakers. Similarly, we have great cultural diversity within the state. So I just want to remind us that although there'll be a little generalization in my talk, really we have to get to a specific culture and a specific language to understand what stories they might have. And here's just a quick reminder of whose ancestral lands we are in the Western Great Lakes. And these are treaty-ceded borders between the United States and these indigenous nations. So we see the northern half of the state is a part of the vast Ojibwe universe that goes from New York to Saskatchewan. We see the Menominee Nation, we see the Ho-Chunk Nation and the Potawatomi, and a little bit of the Dakota here in the state as well. So it just kind of reminds us of who've been here for a long period of time. And these are just the borders as recognized through treaties with the United States. And then just a reminder about ways of being, how people understand the world around them and their place in it are often shaped by what is called conscious cultural connection to place. So if you're in a place for a very, very long time, like say the Menominee, who've been here for 12,000 years, you're going to really understand the ecosystems around you. You're going to understand the culturally important beings around you. And you're often going to kind of develop a body of knowledge that is connected to being in a place for thousands of years. And Wisconsin in the United States is really, really new here in the Western Great Lakes. 1848 to present only accounts for the last 1.5% of the human experience here in the Western Great Lakes. So, 98.5% of the human experience, it was kind of happened prior to the United States even entering the Western Great Lakes. So just kind of reminds us of how new the United States is here. And so the United States' conscious cultural connection to places can be very different. And just kind of reminding us that it's also kind of understanding of places limited by settler colonialism with a goal to replace the existing societies that are already in place prior to colonization. And that here in the Western Great Lakes, there's a radical terraforming of the state, the deforestation of Wisconsin, the filling in of all these wetlands here down in Dejope, and the eradication of the oak savanna ecosystem from the state entirely. And so, not having the same connection to the living environment around us is going to shape our understanding of this space versus the indigenous peoples who did their best to make the most biodiverse, robust ecosystems possible through these compacts with nature that they held. And it's a big difference to have creation stories. So indigenous people have stories passed from generation to generation over thousands and thousands of years. My community goes back 450 generations at least here in this continent. So it's very different than 6 generations or something. So it just kind of reminds us of creation stories and how long this knowledge has been passed through community. And it's very different from colonization stories. So settler colonial societies like the United States are going to be focused on stories of how they successfully colonized a continent. So we have some of these stories on our campus in the Black Hawk marker left by the class of 1888, or the American character marker on Bascom Hill by the North Hall that speaks about rugged individualism and the hard experience of colonizing the rugged West. And I always ask, well, hard for whom exactly? And it just kind of reminds us that the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk both have creation stories that have them coming to be as humans here in the Western Great Lakes, and the Menominee have a creation story where they came to be as a people at the Menominee River, and the Menominee's 5 clans were kind of defined in their experience around this river. And the Ho-Chunk have their creation story of Earthmaker placing humans into Mogashoots, the Red Banks, the first village of the Ho-Chunk Nation. So we kind of think about creation story versus colonization story and how that kind of reflects our understanding of the space in some way. And here's an example of contemporary kind of traditional oral story used as a means of helping us navigate the pandemic. So this particular poster and sentiment was just shared in the last 2 years by the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And when I asked one of the Ojibwe language instructors at Wadukadading, the Ojibwe immersion school up in Lakudare Ojibwe reservation, Dr. Michael McGeehee Sullivan Sr. said, let's keep in mind what we've been taught. And so that's it's translated into English. And he was trying to remind us about our teachings, about how we understand our clan teachings, and what are the stories and values that have been passed to us from our ancestors that allow us to thrive. And so when we remember our teachings, we receive the gifts of strength and clarity. The other orders of creation have helped us to survive, and they will continue to help if we remember these important relationships. And so here we see the bear and the deer, and we see all these culturally important beings that all have stories themselves represented in this drawing, and reminding us that when we remember our teachings, we'll be able to navigate this pandemic more successfully. And it just kind of goes to that depth of relationship. So the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission also helped with a tribal climate adaptation menu. So indigenous peoples, although the climate is changing and culturally important beings are moving more north with the changing climate, indigenous reservations are a fixed place. And so they're really witnessing significant changes to the environment around them. And it just speaks about how these kind of relationships are interwoven bonds. I gotta move something on the way. Let's see. So it just talks about kind of the nature of relationships and how often in Western society we're focused on individualism versus the kind of interconnectedness of all living beings with one another. And it speaks a little bit about indigenous cultures around the globe have applied relational values to recognizing and developing connections with the natural environment. And thinking about all the living beings around us, plant and animal, they consider beings in the natural environment to be the elders and teachers who can teach us valuable lessons. And so if we think about, a kinship relationship to land, if you think that the plants, animals, and water are your relatives, how do you treat your relatives? Versus if you think the plants, animals, and water is a commodity, how do you treat it then? And so there's a very fundamental difference in having a kinship relationship to land versus a property relationship to land. And so thinking about the stories that are all behind these kind of kinship and interrelationships between humans and the natural world around us. And these relationships developed in a multiplicity of cultures that have been passed down as knowledge of place through thousands of years of experience to contemporary generations. So that kind of teaching about the clan safety during the pandemic is reflecting of thousands of years of knowledge developed by the Ojibwe here on this continent. And so it just kind of reminds us about the framework of relationships and the roadmap to a sustainable way of life with respect and understanding for all aspects of creation. And then Menominee, once again, they've been here for 12,000 years, and they kind of talk about these stories about, you know, how they farmed. They had these raised bed gardens in the forests, and they talk about the corn as recognized as the elder, the one who guides and cares for beans and squash and calls together the wild plants around the community. And the Menominee recognize that they're just one part of the community, they're not above it. And they're just very honored to receive the gifts and benefits of the living world around us, as you know, dictated by a creator. So, you know, some generalizations here, these kind of principles of learning that for Indigenous peoples, and this was developed in Canada, but it talks about, you know, well-being of the self, the land, the spirits, the ancestors, and how learning is holistic, reflexive, reflective, experiential, and reciprocal. It talks about really learning is embedded in memory, history, and story. And so we think about how all this knowledge has been passed from generation to generation, often through story, often told in wintertime. And so just think about these bodies of knowledge and principles of learning we have and how important memory, history, and story is to learning. And so it just kind of recognizes a little bit about that. And the quote on the right kind of reminds us about this kind of interrelationship. The Ho-Chunk Nation passed a Rights of Nature amendment in their constitution a few years ago. So the one of the first tribal nations in the United States to pass a Rights of Nature within their own tribal constitution. And they just talk about how everything is sacred. We're all related to trees, the birds, animal, nature herself. We all have a right to exist and thrive. Mother Earth is a sacred soul and has rights not to be exploited for someone's profit. And that was by a Ho-Chunk gentleman named Bill Greendeer, who introduced the proposal for the Rights of Nature Amendment to the Ho-Chunk Constitution. And so it just kind of reminds us about how value systems and how we situate ourselves in the living world, and creation stories versus colonization stories, you know, grandfather teachings, which are these core value systems developed by Indigenous peoples, and that kinship relationship to land versus a property relationship. And, you know, the Ho-Chunk Nation respects springs, lakes, and waters as living beings. They give an animacy to the water, and that culturally important beings exist as our teachers and relatives, and understand that all living beings are following instructions given to them by Creator. And so there's lots of different kind of cultural teachings behind this type of learning. But I just want to point out how important story can be to learning, and how story and knowledge is passed generation to generation, since Indigenous peoples have been on this continent for at least 12,000 years. We don't even know how long people have really been on this continent. It's likely a lot longer, but we're still finding that evidence as we go forward. So I just wanted to share that little overview, a little introduction about story, and as it relates a little bit to sustainability and thinking about creation story of Indigenous peoples and the knowledge that is passed from generation to generation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Professor Delgadillo, I know you had a presentation created. If you'd like to go through that now, that totally works. Otherwise, we can hop into some questions. So whatever works best for you. Oh, I think you might be muted.
You'd think I'd know this by now. I can also talk about a couple of the slides in response to each of the questions if you'd like to start the conversation. I'd be happy to do that, because then we can have a more of a dialogue.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, I can start it off. You both kind of touched on this, but could you expand on the role that storytelling has in spreading and passing down knowledge, culture, and oral history?
I'm happy to start, Erin, if that's okay with you. I think it's certainly important in all three, both formally, and that's sort of what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, and informally. So formally in literature, which is part of what I study, in oral literatures, which Aaron Birdbear was just talking to us about, and in performance and ritual. So all of those are formal aspects of literature, as well as informal storytelling. That is the kind of back and forth that goes on among family members, among peers, among friends, that tells you about a workplace or conveys norms of relationship and social organization or knowledge about particular places. So both of those parts of storytelling and the formal parts of storytelling, that is in literature codified in a written text, or in literature codified in an oral text that is passed along generation to generation at certain times of the year, as Aaron indicated in his presentation, or certain sets of oral literatures that are about particular aspects of life or place are passed along. This also happens through performance and or ritual, sometimes can be a way of storytelling. So I think that in both the formal and informal ways of storytelling, it's very important for conveying knowledge, culture, and oral history. And I would say it's also really important, not only looking backwards in terms of what we know, culture and oral history in the past, but it's also very important looking forward, because all forms of storytelling, whether they're formal or informal, invite us as listeners and readers to join in imagining the future based on what we know now. Ask us to participate in thinking about that future based on what we know now. And so I think they also do that important work.
Thank you. That's awesome. Aaron, if you want to go ahead.
Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. Just what role does storytelling play in spreading and passing down knowledge, culture, and oral history?
Yeah, well, clearly for us Indigenous peoples, story has been the backbone of how we've thrived as sovereign nations here in the Western Hemisphere. I think about, all these important leaders within our communities, whether they're clan leaders or in the case of, we have clans and we have bundle keepers in my society, people who have important relics that are passed from generation to generation. And I think about the bundle keepers and some of the objects they have within their bundles are thousands and thousands of years old and have been passed from community to the next. And they carry this knowledge forward with us to understand our value system and the knowledge we built to thrive in these particular environments. If you've ever been to North Dakota, the winter is pretty harsh, but my ancestors are able to thrive, open travel in the winter, no problem. Permanent trade centers in the middle of this hostile kind of winter space, no problem. Going up to Hudson Bay in the winter, no problem. And so how do you accomplish all of that kind of activity? Well, you're going to have that information shared with you in your community and passed generation to generation to generation. And so I think for us as Indigenous peoples, our cultures, our knowledge, our survival have really been supported by storytelling and how knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. And in particular, I mentioned here in Wisconsin in particular, that stories can only be shared sometime during certain times of the year. In Wisconsin, storytelling usually happens when there's snow on the ground. And that if there's snow isn't on the ground, then it's inappropriate to share some stories. And so with climate change, that's putting a little challenge to things with less snowfall and different types of snowfall during the year. But we would see some kind of protocols about when things are shared and why we would share them during certain times of the year versus other times of the year. So when I think about Indigenous culture, I think, in creation story and story is just the heart of who we are as a people. And it's how we come together and share with one another and learn with one another. And so I just think about that, how important storytelling is to Indigenous peoples. And largely, it's, with the printing press and the kind of forms of transmissible paper and writing have been relatively new to humanity if we look at our grand scheme of how long we've been humans. And so storytelling has been just a place for all humans of sharing information along the way. We think about, the early forms of, if you look at the Bible and how it was transcribed by humans by hand for such a long period of time. And although that probably started in a different form, in order for it to be shared, it had to be written down. But at the heart of communities coming together is storytelling still today. And so I just think, for us as Indigenous peoples, it is those stories that are often not shared in public settings, but usually within ceremony, within community. There's a lot of sacred knowledge that is not shared outside of Indigenous communities. I think of the Ho-Chunk and my ancestors, the Dene. You're kind of binary. You're either 1 or 0. You're either Dene or you're not Dene. And if you're not Dene, then you just don't need to know. So there's a lot of sacred information, and the Ho-Chunk operates similarly, where although we would love to know more cultural information about these cultures and these nations, often this information is kept within the community for all sorts of important reasons. And I still think of that today as like we still have a lot to learn about this place through the stories of Indigenous peoples, but we're not privy to those stories just yet until we heal our relationships with Native American nations. We need a little reconciliation work in order for us to kind of gain some of this really fundamental understanding of this place that we're in today. And I just kind of think about how that knowledge is still sustaining the Indigenous community, and there's a reason why they kind of guard that information so zealously, so that the knowledge that has allowed them to thrive isn't exploited in some way, and it doesn't undermine their well-being in some way.
Thank you so much. Those are really insightful answers. We have a more specific question for Professor Delgadillo. I don't know, this would maybe be a good chance to share your presentation as well, but I can start off with the question. So it's just, how has your work helped to uncover the stories and lived experiences of Latina women in the Midwest?
Okay, well, let me talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing more recently. And I was thinking about this question of sustainability. I have been thinking about this question of sustainability in relation to literature. Let me, can you see, you can see that okay, right? And so I've been thinking about, and I was just thinking, Aaron, about what you said about, it's so true about when stories are shared among your community and other Native communities, but also the ways that I have learned. One of the ways that I've had access to learning about Native American worldviews and relationship to environment is by reading literature, is by reading people like Louise Erdrich, right, who's from the Dakotas, right, and writes so eloquently about the relationship to a particular place and the values that infuse the lives of the characters that she talks about. And so in this particular project, I've been working with a group of colleagues across the Midwest, and my portion of it is really looking at Latinx literatures and sustainability in them. Thinking about Latinx placemaking in the Midwest, a region that we inhabit as settlers, right, as part of settler colonial society. And yet, how often among Latinxes, the relationship or some knowledge of ancestral Indigenous past is not entirely lost to us. It emerges in these traces, and it emerges in the literature. I began in this project by talking about Rosario Morales's and Aurora Levins Morales's collection Cosecha and Other Stories. And as you can see from this quote on the screen, it begins by contrasting the experience of living in the rural countryside of Puerto Rico versus living in the urban city of Chicago. I think it's a passage that highlights for us the distinction and the way in which we are asked to live in a urban environment, to forget our relationship to nature, to forget our relationship to the environment that we inhabit. And that doing that, as she highlights here, that when doing that also forces you to forget the other people with whom you inhabit that environment, that those things are interrelated. So it does come back a little bit to what Aaron said, that your relationship to the natural world, to the environment, to the place that you inhabit is also going to determine your relationship to other peoples and how you see them and how you see yourself in relation to them. And there's a very common trope in American literature, not only American literature, this picture on the left, which shows us that, eternal story of the individual out in the rugged environment, conquering the rugged environment outdoors on his own, right? And sometimes the variation on that is the individual woman conquering the rugged outdoors on her own. But I was interested in thinking about how Latinx literatures about the experience of living in the West are actually doing this on the right side, are showing us what our relationship is to all of the environment, both other species and creatures in the environment, as well as other people in that environment. And I was sort of guided by this in thinking about my colleague Priscilla Ibarra's work. She suggests that Mexican-American literary consciousness about the environment is not driven by an individual narrator's experience of nature, but instead advancing ideas of humans living in healthy relationship with each other and the natural environment. And she calls that good life writing in Chicano and Mexican American writing. So this particular project, I looked at Cosecha, The Last Laugh, and Other Stories, Ruben Martinez's Crossing Over, Sandra Cisneros' novel Caramelo, and Fred Arroyo's collection of short stories, Western Avenue and Other Fictions. These are stories set across the Midwest, Chicago, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and involve a variety of different kinds of environments. And all are concerned with this question of place as opposed to space. So not that abstract, unknown thing of space, but the materiality of particular locations, our affective bonds to them, and what that might mean about how we live with them environmentally. And in particular, I want to look at The Last Laugh and Other Stories, a story in this collection called Killdeer by Hugo Martinez Ceros, which revolves around a man and his two sons. This takes place in about 1950s Chicago. His name is Jose Maria, and he works in the steel mill. He works in a steel mill. He's part of a migration of workers who come to that city to work in steel mills, in large part because they are displaced from agricultural agricultural work and lands in Mexico. And so Jose Maria is there, and the text tells us, Jose Maria paused to observe his sons. They would grow up one day, and the thought of their working in the steel mill tormented him. He slashed the earth, but could not still his foreman's voice. And his foreman tells him, your sons will work for me too, Jose, you'll see, which this obviously makes Jose Maria a little bit extremely anxious, right? And actually makes him a little bit crazy in the story. And it was really interesting to me in this day and age when we think about, good jobs or what constitutes a good job, and whether a good job is just about how much money you make, or it's also about what you do, because clearly this is the kind of job that people would think of as a good job, high-paying steel mill job. But the story reveals that it's actually a very degraded environment, and that is actually a job that is further degrading the environment. And that is also reflected in the human relations among those in the plant and the kind of racial discrimination that unfolds in the plant, and that Jose Maria experiences, and which he tries to escape. He tries not to live by that model by instituting for himself and among his sons the practice of milpa. And the practice of milpa is taking unused land, you'll see that on the left, and the right, creating a kind of community garden, a specific kind of community garden that Aaron actually referenced earlier. Let me see if oops, that slide is gone. Is it? Oh, my milpa side is gone. But it is a particular kind of community garden, shared land in which the three sisters, three crops that support each other are grown together: squash, beans, and corn. Milpa is a practice, an indigenous practice of growing that's very common across Mexico and very common among Mexican working class people. And among Mexican working class people who migrate to the United States and create little milpas in their neighborhoods. Jose Maria actually creates a milpa on unused railroad lands in South Chicago. And this was actually a community practice in the Chicago urban area. And he and his sons tend it, an attempt to build some kind of environment for themselves that is different than that degraded industrial environment that they live in all the time. And so I think it's a story that gestures towards the ways that ancestral knowledges can be carried and passed down even to those who are not a part of recognized or enrolled indigenous tribes, including in Mexico, right? So to say that one knows something about ancestral practices or carries that is not to say that one is Native American or Indian, right? There are actual Indian nations within Mexico as well who are struggling for recognition and land rights. But I think it pushes us toward thinking about these other ways of knowing and being in the world that are trying to be deployed in the places where Latinos are trying to make space for themselves in the Midwest. And this work that I spoke to you about comes from this new project, Building Sustainable Worlds, that is really looking at those kind of everyday expressions and practices of Latino communities in the Midwest, how they're reaching out and reacting and working with other communities of people in the region to create more sustainable places.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I'd love to look more into that. Just the gardens, that's just such an awesome thing.
Thank you.
I guess moving on, we have a more specific question for Erin. Just working on campus, what are some of the methods that you use in your work to ensure that underrepresented students feel like they have a voice?
I think about the Native Nations UW initiative that we're doing right now. So in 2015 is the first time the University of Wisconsin-Madison hosted the elected leaders of the Native Nations of Wisconsin at our institution. So it only took us 167 years as a university to get to this place where we thought maybe long-term relationships with the indigenous nations would be beneficial for us, for both of us, mutually kind of areas of mutual interest we could work on together. And so it really changed kind of our institution in many ways of thinking about long-term relationships versus kind of just one-off or ad hoc relationships that might form along the way. But I bring this up because the Native Nations UW initiative, we wanted to make sure we had student participation. And so we have student representatives who are part of the Native Nations UW initiative to help us kind of craft and guide the policies that we're doing. And so I think about, for Native American community of this particular institution, we're trying to always include student voice in what we're doing. And, there also, we have the 5 Native American student organizations on campus, and they periodically have needs or issues. And I try to do my best to support the Native American student organizations whenever they ask for support. For instance, the Indigenous Law Students Association wants to have a permanent installation of the flags of the Native Nations of Wisconsin in the law school. And so how would you accomplish that? So what kind of connections could I help the Indigenous Law Student Association in doing this important representative work of tribal governance within the law school? And so helping them connect to the Great Lakes Intertribal Council and start the process for requesting flags from tribal nations. And so I think about, supporting student groups individually. I also think about trying to be available and accessible to Native American students in whatever ways they might need support for themselves on this campus. As a former, assistant dean of student diversity programs in the School of Education, I was obviously thinking about historically underrepresented or excluded populations from higher education and the ways that we need to support them. And it's one thing to recruit underrepresented or excluded students, historically excluded students. It's another thing to retain them. And so what are the ways we have to accommodate groups and make sure that they feel that their cultures are valued within our institution, that they see the knowledge of their kind of communities within the curriculum, that we do our best to connect them to their peers and so they can find each other on campus, and that we do our best to connect them to communities off of campus. And so I think of all the different types of work we can do under those kind of 4 pillars of supporting underrepresented or historically excluded populations on campus, of making sure they're supported, the knowledge is reflected in our curriculum, that we offer culturally relevant events for them as an institutional community, and we do our best to connect them with communities off campus. So I think if we strive to do all those different activities with our historically underrepresented populations, and we see the many different programs doing that work, whether it's First Wave, Posse, Center for Educational Opportunity, the Native American Center for Health Professions. We see all these wonderful units on campus that are trying to support historically underrepresented or excluded populations within the various majors and activities of campus.
Thank you so much. I have a question. Well, actually, I want to remind everyone, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat and I can read them out loud. I have a question for both speakers, just kind of going along the lines of often human emotions and experiences are left out from conversations on historical and current events. How can we work as a society to incorporate these voices when discussing current and historical events and issues? And I kind of just want to say this can tie to a lot of things, including effects felt from climate change, inhumane treatment at the border, the history of colonization, but just like a larger trend of not hearing the voices of the people actually experiencing these things.
I think one of the things that's really important is including in the curriculum of UW-Madison and allowing students the opportunity to study from multiple cultures. So our ethnic studies units and their curriculums, I think, are really important in terms of being able to offer the opportunity for all students to consider from the perspective of Latino studies knowledge, of Native American studies knowledge, of African American studies knowledge, of Asian American studies knowledge, and the scholarship that has been developed there, what the life experience has been of those populations, and to learn about their histories and experiences. I also think that it's really important in terms of the sustainability question to think about and to ask and to invite these communities into the conversation about sustainability and knowledge about sustainability, to ask them to think about what that looks like in their own communities and cultures. What does that knowledge look like? Because it might not look like what we think it should like. It might not look like what that would be generated somewhere else. And I come back to the stories, right? You could read them and miss what this story is telling us about milpa and the interrelationship of crops and the interrelationship of people, right? Unless we're asking questions and allowing people to explore that from their own standpoint, from their own experience, and in relation to others. So I think that definitely helps to bring out a wider array and section of the human experience and our affective attachments by inviting people into that conversation and making that question possible and allowing for deeper exploration in the knowledge of each of those areas.
I can just add a little bit about story in the sense that, I was a physical oceanography undergraduate at the University of Washington, Seattle. So I was a physics and math major, nothing to do with story. And as a person who's so invested in the quantitative sciences, I've always felt like numbers should tell the story. But, in explaining like indigenous language preservation needs and working with our UW system recently, there are fewer than 6 speakers of Menominee language today. There's fewer than 25 speakers of Ho-Chunk language today. There's fewer than 50 Ojibwe speaking peoples in Wisconsin today. And so I feel like those numbers should tell the story, but they don't really tell the story of how indigenous language transmission has been so negatively impacted among the generations. And when I tell the story of how my grandfather was treated as a child and why he didn't transmit the language of Dene Bazad, the language of the people, to my mother, is well, he was abducted when he was 7, and the United States was actively trying to destroy all Native American language and culture until 1975 when I was in elementary school. And so the United States had thought that the best way to assimilate the indigenous population into the settler colonial society, but was destroying all of our cultures and languages through almost a century of child separation. And so when I tell the story of my grandfather, Nalwood Kilachine, who came out of the boarding schools as Robert Harvey, he gets an entirely renamed kind of persona after being removed from his family at age 7 and not returned until he was 18. He spent 11 years forcibly separated from his family for the express purpose of destroying Dene Bazad within him and his understanding of Navajo culture. And so, you know, he tells a story about how he was treated as a child, where if he was caught speaking Dene Bazad or doing any kind of cultural practice, he was thrown into a small hole outside the school. It had a metal lid, and it was a very confining hole. And so you had to kind of scrunch up in a little kind of ball to fit in the hole, and then they locked it on top of you. And the only way to get out of the hole was to be among your own feces. You had to defecate in the hole, and they kept you in the hole for a period of time with your own bowel movement as a kind of psychological torture to youth, to try to get them these really deep negative associations with their language and culture to kind of prevent them from trying to transmit them to the next generation. So it's one thing to say there's fewer than 5 Menominee speakers today or 6 Menominee speakers per day, but people to understand the mechanisms of why that is. You know, indigenous peoples haven't lost their languages. Loss implies that if you're just a little more careful, you wouldn't have misplaced it or you wouldn't have lost it. Whereas, you know, we've been facing culture and language eradication for a century, and it left a lot of these scars and traumas within us that we are still trying to overcome. So I think about that of, you know, I in my physical science side of myself wants to say the numbers should tell the story. You know, that should be enough for everybody. But it's not. People just can't connect with these abstract kind of things. They have to hear kind of a human story of what that experience is really about to understand indigenous language kind of revitalization efforts today. And so I think about the power of story, of even telling these kind of narratives of how our ancestors struggled or suffered under kind of settler assimilation, settler colonial assimilation policy, and how horrific it really was. But at the same time, you know, it's not going to help people to dwell on these kind of really traumatic kind of things and not be able to be actionable on them in some way. And so I used to provide most of the First Nations cultural landscape tours of campus, and I'm talking about horrific things. I'm talking about ethnic cleansing. I'm talking about language eradication. I'm talking about all these really hard topics. But I'm also strategically using humor throughout the tour to bring us back to the present, to bring us back to the moment. So these are things we can talk about. These are stories we can share with one another. You know, having people feel deeply guilty or deeply shameful is not going to be helpful. And so how do we kind of model for ourselves how we can discuss these really difficult issues and chapters within our own kind of shared histories with one another? And so I think about, you know, numbers aren't enough. Stories really illuminate what is happening to people and their experiences on our planet, and how important those stories really are. And although I just wish a very simple memo of a few numbers would explain the kind of traumas and severities that indigenous peoples have faced. It's these personal stories and cultural stories that are so important for people to understand how they can contribute toward, you know, revitalization and reconciliation with indigenous peoples today.
I think that's also the way that people can recognize their connection to each other, and their shared connections. I think about the experience of children being separated from their parents at the US-Mexico border as they're trying to migrate, and the trauma that creates and induces, and knowing what we know about how that affects people, knowing what we know already about the history of that in both Native American history and African American history, right? Knowing what we know about that we still, that gets engaged. So that says we do still need to know the emotional, how that emotionally resonates and affects and impacts not only individuals but generations in order to understand that. But I think it helps to connect. Storytelling helps to connect different populations to recognize in some ways that they have shared conditions of language eradication. Some languages and accents are prestigious and accepted, and other kinds of languages and accents are not viewed as prestige language or accents and are to be forgotten or are to be beaten out of you. So that's an experience certainly that also many Latinas and Latinos have had in the United States. And so I think it points us to some of the ways in which you can build coalition and build alliance with others around contesting the view that there is only one way and that there is only one best way to live and be in the world.
Awesome, thank you. I do think it's such a good reminder to understand that there are so many historical and emotions left out of these stories, but it's important to remember them and also look forward and see how we can kind of repair our relationships. I think we have a question in the chat. Okay, I'll read this out loud. One thing that Aaron had touched on earlier is the contrasting views of nature as having either intrinsic or instrumental value. I know that generally Indigenous peoples place a very strong intrinsic value on natural resources, but I feel that our current society more strongly views nature as a commodity. In terms of solving the climate crisis, how do you think people can go about shifting the view towards a more intrinsic view of nature?
I'll just a quick answer. A Ho-Chunk elder told me 22 years ago when I first started working here that people don't change when they see the light. They change when they feel the fire. And that's just because we become kind of aware of an issue and understand an issue deeply, behavior change is really hard. It's hard for all of us. And so people, even though they might be enlightened and realize, their behaviors are contributing to sort of negative kind of thing, it's really hard to change behavior. You have to have some sort of, outside force that pushes you to new behaviors. And often that's economic, it comes at a cost to you to not change your behavior. And so I think about just that message of Indigenous peoples, or we said Ho-Chunk elder shared with me, people don't change when they see the light, they change when they feel the fire. And I think with climate change, all of us are starting to feel the fire. It's starting to have tremendous economic impacts on all of us. And I think people are going to be more cognizant of the interrelationship we have with the living world around us and how our treatment of the living world around us impacts us. And so unfortunately, it's a little kind of self-centered view of thinking, okay, if I don't engage climate change, I'm going to suffer in some way. So maybe I should figure out how to engage in climate change work in some way, because it's for the safety and well-being of myself and others that I would be invested in changing my behaviors in some way. So we're starting to see the massive tornadoes. We're starting to see increased hurricanes. We're starting to see mega droughts. Madison or Wisconsin is currently in a moderate drought, an exceptional drought in some places. So it just we're starting to feel the fire. And I think that will propel people to kind of possibly change their behavior in some way. But unless people feel the fire, even being enlightened and being aware of the situation, humans rarely change their behavior without some kind of outside force really pushing them along.
I think one of the things that we also need to do is to recognize that responding to the climate crisis is something that is something that's going to require us to actually act on and live on our values and principles of diversity and equity and inclusion. That is, you can respond to the climate crisis and look to the same old kind of tech wizard to come up with the great idea that's going to save us all, which is not to say that there aren't technological advances that are not going to be useful in combating climate crisis. But I think there's a wider set of knowledge and responses to solving the climate crisis that come from multiple communities and come from the way that those communities live and live with each other that we need to pay attention to, that we need to pull those voices into the conversation. And we need to foreground those voices in thinking about how we're going to collectively solve the climate crisis, rather than seeing that as something that's only going to get solved in one place by an elite group of people who can do this. Because that also suggests, some parts of the world are just a natural resource as opposed to a place where people live and inhabit. So I think thinking about really having an equitable, diverse, and inclusive conversation in solving the climate crisis is really going to be critical. And that means that a lot of stories are going to be important. Many, many stories are going to be important to solving it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I know we're coming to the end of our time. If either of you had any closing remarks you want to say, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your hosting this and enjoyed the conversation. I learned much from you. Thank you to my co-presenter and also to the audience for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Delgadillo. Much appreciated your analysis. As a physical science person, my strength is not literary analysis, so it's always wonderful to see people with that expertise share that with us. So thank you. And I would just say, the Ho-Chunk have such a powerful understanding of Dejope, and we're only healing our relationship with them now to further understand that. And I think about this, a quick short story is like, when we asked the Ho-Chunk Nation to name our new residence hall, they didn't pay. We wanted to help us leverage this beautiful place and the 12,000-year human story of our place for learning on campus. And what better way than to have a residence hall connected to the story of this space? And so the Ho-Chunk gave us the name for the residence hall, and they gave us Wongshe Komikla, and that's translates as where the person rests. And it's a story about the human who fell in love with the water spirit in the lake and went on a journey with a little mysticism, was transformed into a fish, swam back up the river to be in the lake with his true love, the water spirit. And we have water spirit effigy mounds on campus on Observatory Hill. One used to be on Bascom Hill, where Bascom Hall is today. There are a series of water spirits built around the lake. And these are large scale monumental arts on the earth that are hundreds of feet large. And so these representational figures on the earth, really powerful. And so the Ho-Chunk had gifted us this story, Wongshe Komikla, the story of the lake and how their culture understands the animacy of water. And we as a learning community said, that's kind of hard to say. Can you give us something easier? I'm like, a place of learning can't learn something? You got to be kidding me. So the Ho-Chunk came back with the name Dejope, which is a little easier for us to say. Although we mostly mispronounce it, and the Ho-Chunk cringe. We always want to soften the J because there's not a lot of D-E-J words in the English language. So we want to make the J soft, but it's a hard J like jump. So it's Dejope. And so we ended up, that didn't work as well as everybody thought it would anyway, because people have a hard time pronouncing that word correctly. So I just a little story about, gifts that Indigenous peoples give to us and then how open we are to receiving them. And unfortunately, we as a learning community, a place of learning, we're not open to receiving a gift that would have connected us to this powerful ancient story of the lake right next to us, their name for the lake, Wongshe Komikla, versus Lake Mendota. And Lake Mendota is total gibberish. It was created for a land speculation brochure from Governor Farwell. And they thought it was an Ojibwe word, which is not even from this place, right? They thought it would be like, and it's not an Ojibwe word. It's not any word. And then they built the rhyming lakes off of it. So Kaganza, Wabisa, all that's meant to built off of the word Mendota. They all 3 syllables, they all rhyme. And so I think about settler colonialism and how we come up with names for things. In this case, once again, commodification needed to sell land to entice settlement. and made up a bunch of lake names that are just total gibberish, versus, you know, connecting to this deep culture, this conscious cultural connection to place, where the Ho-Chunk have this beautiful understanding of water, and the story encapsulates their understanding of water in the name of the lake, where the person rests, Wongshik-Komiklo.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Evan, for joining. And yes, thank you
Thanks
so
very much.
speakers.
Appreciate it.
You, and I know we all learned a lot. And stay tuned for our upcoming Earth Week event on food justice. It'll be April 18th, I believe. I'll double check on that. But yes, thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
April 20th.
It's a good night.
Good night.